Hi guys, gonna do a little interactive lesson and talk a little bit about earthquakes and how to locate an earthquake epicenter. So before we do that, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce a few terms that are new. You guys are familiar with the word fault, I hope. And you should know that a fault is an area of weakness within or on the surface of the earth where rocks slip and slide. So they're actually moving along this area of fracture that results from stress, typically along plate boundaries, but not necessarily always. And what happens when there is stress along a fault is eventually the strength of the fault or the rocks along the fault is exceeded, and so there's so much stress that eventually the rock breaks and it slips along this plane of weakness and it releases energy in the form of seismic waves. So an analogy would be like dropping a pebble onto a pond. And so if the pebble is slippage along the fault, the ripples that are created from that impact would be like the seismic waves or the energy that radiates outward from the slip along the fault. And so you can see those kind of concentric rings here in this cross section. And I want to identify something that seismologists call the focus of the earthquake. So here's the fault, and in cross-sectional view, I don't know if you can see these little arrows, but this would be an example of a normal fault. So the area on the right would be the hanging wall, on the left is the footwall, and there's movement exactly where that focal point is located. So for some reason or another, the stress is greatest there, and the rocks slip at that point and release energy in the form of these seismic waves. So if you look above the fault, there's another term up here, and you can see right there, we have what's called the epicenter. So a lot of earthquakes happen with depth along plate boundaries, and because of that, it's difficult to kind of assess what's happening tens or hundreds of kilometers below the earth. So when you watch the nightly news, they actually report as if the earthquake happened at the epicenter. So the epicenter is directly above the focal point on the Earth's surface. So if you watch the news and journalists report saying that the epicenter was in Kyoto, Japan, or Los Angeles, California, that's what they're referencing. Okay, so moving on. Here's just an example of what's happening during an earthquake. So the fault here is kind of difficult to see right there. So that would be on the surface of the earth. And this would be a great example of like the San Andreas Fault in California. It's not mine, it's not yours, it's California's fault. Ha, get it? Anyway, this would be an example of a transform fault. And an analogy here is if you were to hold like a dowel rod in your hands, and I don't know if you know what that is, but just a stick basically, and you bend the stick, you're deforming the stick ductily, right? Eventually the strength of your hands on that stick, or the force of your hands, will exceed the strength of the stick, and the stick will break, so it'll behave brittly, and it'll actually break and then kind of rebound or bounce back and forth, releasing energy. And that's what's going to happen along these fault zones where there's an initial break. So you can see kind of here. And rocks are slipping and sliding in opposite directions. Again, this is like this San Andreas Fault. So this would be the Pacific Plate over here. And then this would be the North American Plate. And it's that displacement that causes a release of energy in the form of seismic waves. So in our analogy, that bouncing back and forth of our dowel rod or stick would be like those seismic waves radiating out from the earthquake epicenter. So it's not just one bounce and then rebound, it's a series of those. So oftentimes we get what's called aftershocks following an earthquake. So we might have a big rupture or displacement of rock and release of energy. And then we might have a little bit, or actually for days, we can have aftershocks that follow that are similar in magnitude to the initial rupture along the fault. So how do we study these earthquakes? We use something called seismology, and seismology is the study of earthquakes through a piece of equipment called a seismograph. And so I'm going to show you what a seismograph looks like here in the next slide. But basically, the real primitive versions of these were designed by the Chinese a long time ago, hundreds of years ago. Today, we have kind of a more advanced design. And so here's an example of a seismograph. And so what you can see here is you have kind of a support system, like a beam, that's got a suspended weight attached to it. And so as the ground moves during an earthquake, so here the ground would be shaking or moving during the earthquake, horizontally, for example, what happens is that suspended weight moves with the earth and it records the earth's motion here on this rotating drum of paper. And that little printout shows us the amount of energy recorded in the form of seismic waves like P waves and S waves and then surface waves. So there are these seismographs all over the world that are designed to detect earthquakes in real time. So if you go to the USGS website, and actually I'll make a little short video of this as well, you can see live time or real-time earthquakes in the United States and then anywhere around the world. And as you guys know, most of these earthquakes are centered or have focal points along plate tectonic boundaries. There are a few exceptions, like within the last day, there was an earthquake in Hawaii associated with volcanic activity. We get them frequently in Lake Yellowstone for the same reason. So, and you can also get earthquakes in some unnatural areas like the central United States from things like fracking, which we'll talk about later. So I'm going to stop here, trying to make these like mini lessons. And then in the next video, what I'll do is I'll talk about the principle of triangulation and identifying an earthquake epicenter using seismographs and these little printouts, and also distance and time travel for seismic waves. All right, signing off for now. Peace.